Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jen Wong from Mozilla, and today we're having an important conversation about ShadowDragon, which is a surveillance tech company whose tools are being used by law enforcement to monitor people across the internet. As you can imagine, these surveillance activities have serious implications for privacy, activism, and digital rights. Today, I am excited to be joined by the lovely Nabiha Syed, who is the executive director of Mozilla Foundation, and the wonderful Esra'a Shafei, who is a Mozilla fellow and the founder of the Surveillance Watch. So to start us off, Isra, I know you've been following ShadowDragon for a while now. Can you tell us more about what ShadowDragon is and how it operates?
Sure. So ShadowDragon, as you mentioned, is a company that develops surveillance software. More literally, they are named after the dragonfly, which is a predator that has large eyes made up of thousands of tiny lenses. So basically supporting its 360-degree view. And the emphasis here is the ability to track with supposedly high accuracy from a multitude of angles and sources. So on this front, ShadowDragon developed a tool called SocialNet, which enables its customers to access and analyze data from over 200 platforms, anything from e-commerce sites to social media to niche communities. And by inputting identifiers like email address, username, phone number, or any alias, this tool can map out a person's digital life. And that basically results in revealing relationships, social graphs, interest, physical locations, and much more.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of information that they're tracking is really quite alarming. And I'm curious from what you've seen in your work, who is the most at risk from surveillance tech like this?
Yeah, I mean, so through Surveillance Watch, we have been curating a lot of data about the types of technologies that are being used specifically for surveillance, spyware, who is purchasing this information. And as a result, we've seen that a lot of the times it's targeting journalists, rights advocates, including protesters, marginalized communities, immigrants and refugees. LGBTQ plus communities, and increasingly also students, in particular, any who participate in campus protests or divestment movements. And surveillance tech like this is also not just used by government agencies, but we're also seeing a lot of corporations looking to suppress criticisms, control public narratives about their companies, or bury any evidence of corruption, especially when we look at climate activists and whatnot. So in both situations, it tends to be these types of communities that are targeted the most.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the current political climate and especially how fast that the technology is advancing only compounds a lot of these risks that we're seeing. And Nabiha, I want to turn towards you and talk about this line between using public data and respecting individuals' privacy. I mean, just because data is out there doesn't mean that it should be used in any context. And so, how do you think we should define this boundary and navigate the trade-off here?
Thank you for this question, Jen. And it's such a joy to be really on any platform, digital or otherwise, with Esra'a. This question, right, of like, well, it's disclosed to some, but it shouldn't be used in this particular way, is one that's actually vexed um, jurists, technologists, civil society for quite some time. It's not a new problem. So in the United States, which is where a lot of these technologies and a lot of these companies that create this technology are based, and then they export it throughout the world, there is a legal doctrine that says any information disclosed to a third party loses its privacy. And that's been the constitutional standard for quite some time. And so every time we have an advancement in technology, we have elements of this question of like, well, why this data was disclosed in one way, but is being used in this other way to harm surfaces. And so there was actually a Supreme Court case in 2012 presented with this exact same question about GPS trackers placed on cars. And there the argument was, well, listen, if you're a cop, you can use your eyes to watch all the cars going around the neighborhood, and that would be public information with which you could decide to do anything. Does it change if you use technology to augment that capability, that observation, that surveillance, by attaching a little device on top of a car. Actually, it was underneath the car. And this decision was didn't provide the clarity that we want about resolving public and private. We got one justice saying, well, we really need to think about this as the digital age progresses. That was 2012. We did have a finding in that case that said, well, attaching the GPS tracker, the attachment of a thing on property, that should invoke privacy interests. So we should care about that. Think back to just 5 years ago, Clearview AI, another software that sort of presents this question, and what Clearview AI was doing. And Kashmir Hill has written about this brilliantly and has a fantastic book about this. Clearview AI goes around, just scrapes up all this biometric data, all these people's faces, offers it in a database, and allows anyone to use this commercial service. They are selling it for a profit to track where people have been using facial recognition. Again, pictures disclosed in one context, being used for surveillance in another. Now, while the Supreme Court case I mentioned in 2012 was about what the government could do, the question presented in 2020 with Clearview was all about, well, is it okay for a private company to be collecting this kind of information? So closer to what we're seeing here. And there they put forth all these First Amendment arguments saying, well, we have the right to do this, and it's part of our speech in doing it, which I would contest is not a particularly persuasive argument, because if you're making First Amendment, aka free speech arguments, the thing that you're doing should actually contribute to free expression, which of course mass surveillance does not. It does the opposite. What we sort of start to see is this evolution, again, in the law, and then I'm going to switch to what should happen. What we see in the law is this distinction between, if this is something that people could just kind of naturally do on their own by watching you in public, out in the person, it's okay. But when technology accelerates your capability beyond what anyone would reasonably expect, then all of a sudden it feels a little squishy. So long story short, this distinction, is it public, is it private, who decides, is one that is unresolved, long-standing, has been a problem. And while we wait for courts or regulation to resolve this, again, in the United States, this technology is being exported elsewhere. And as Esra'a discussed, being used on people and creating real harm. And so that's why there is a need for the public to sort of step up and say, you know what, while you figure all of that out, like, we want to apply public pressure. We want accountability. We won't stand for this.
I see. Yeah, I think the history here is super interesting. So I guess thinking about, all these court cases from before, are there scenarios in which you think the use of surveillance tools like ShadowDragon might actually be justified? And if so, who should get to decide that?
I think the who question is particularly interesting here, right? Because when we're saying, is there a circumstance in which it's justified? We're saying, is there a public interest that is served in some universe that would allow this to happen? And I think the next question is, could we actually confine the use of this technology to just that limited universe? Or do we run the risk of it being expanded to all these other use cases that we're seeing right now? When you have a private company doing this, they're not likely, in absence of a regulation restricting them, just going to keep their market as narrow as possible. They're not going to be in that narrow use case they're imagining. They're going to go where the market incentivizes them. So they're going to expand, meaning it won't stay in that little narrow zone. It's always going to be big. It's always going to be overbroad. And what that means is that's affecting our privacy, our expression rights, our civil liberties. To me, that's unacceptable. There are people who argue that, well, maybe it shouldn't be private companies that have this capability. Maybe it should be the government. The government is constrained by, the Fourth Amendment and other sort of privacy approaches. But what we can see is that there are at times political ends that could be served that are not necessarily for the public interest of all minorities, just for some. And again, I think it cannot be confined to that small layer. So while I love the thought experiment of like, there might be a universe that's small and possible, the inherent creep that will always happen, to me, says that this should not be used in this way at all.
Right, definitely. Yeah, what happens in practice looks a lot different than the hypothetical.
Yeah.
there's also been a lot of discourse around the role of platforms and institutions in addressing these privacy concerns. And I want to come back to Esra'a for this next question. We're seeing some global institutions treat surveillance tech as cutting edge or even something worthy of celebrating. And how do you think we should approach this growing narrative of surveillance as innovation?
So surveillance companies have always been kind of celebrated. Well, not all of them, but specifically, companies like ShadowDragon celebrated as innovative or even described as ethical. In this specific example, ShadowDragon was named a 2023 technology pioneer by the World Economic Forum, a recognition that basically highlights that the company's, significant impact on society. And this is, directly from their press release, that this is a positive company, an ethical company that is creating life-changing, very innovative, cutting-edge tools, and they're being celebrated and mingling even within civil society circles in these types of forums. So this kind of acknowledgement by influential global institutions really helps normalize the use of surveillance tools. And when we're framing them as necessary advancements and admiring their technical capabilities without questioning its purpose or serious harms and how these harms impact every single one of us, and we basically just need to repeatedly call out this culture of enablement that is pushing this false narrative that surveillance is inherently beneficial to society. The other thing is, when you see a company like this be celebrated for creating so-called ethical innovations, you can easily tell just by its clients and partnerships, in this case, government and immigration agencies, what the intentions are. Based on the track records of the typical customers, we know that that means disproportionate targeting of marginalized groups and vulnerable communities. And we see surveillance contractors, while they may be lucrative, don't often succeed in painting themselves as ethical tech, worth celebrating by notable institutions. So this is why it should alarm us that ShadowDragon is not only getting away with selling tools of mass surveillance, but it's doing so by painting itself as a company creating innovative and ethical technologies to solve challenging problems like organized crime, and therefore saving lives, and in the process, just collecting awards for it and getting into all of these very influential spaces. And the World Economic Forum is just one example. ShadowDragon has received many other accolades. So how we approach this, I think, goes beyond holding one single company accountable, but also looking at who is knowingly using it, who is buying it, what is the role of third parties in making this even possible at a technical level, but also who is enabling this through positive coverage. That includes media, awards and recognition from institutions, because companies like ShadowDragon also need a village to succeed. And this requires basically, a wider framework for accountability.
Right. And I think this actually segues nicely into my next question to Nabiha, which is how do these rights frameworks or policies need to change to curb this kind of surveillance?
So one key thing would be extremely helpful, which is this sort of longstanding premise in US law that an individual has no expectation of privacy and information given voluntarily to third parties. Like, that needs to change. And, that has evolved and is actually a far more nuanced understanding of privacy is live in the EU and in many other contexts throughout the world, which is actually how the information is being used and what rights, like the right to free or the right to free association or the right of freedom of movement, all of those rights need to be considered first and be given great weight before you even begin to entertain something that might challenge those well-enshrined rights. And so you need the bedrock of actually, we need to have more nuance around this sort of voluntarily disclosed third-party information, because being disclose in one context does not mean that you're okay with it being used in every single context, right? If I'm giving up data in order to buy some dog food, I certainly do not think that that should be packaged up and used and sold as a service in a very different context that might inhibit my freedoms. So we need to change the bedrock. We have to change the rights calculus for these well-enshrined rights that we have. And then if there are any moments in which that balance, perhaps like a state's interest to enforce its borders, is very narrowly constructed with a lot of clarity and then crucially transparency about what data is being used, in what way. Like, I love the reporting that we've seen on this. Like, journalists are doing incredible work. It's difficult to report on this, and it shouldn't just rely on the courage of a few journalists for us to find out all of the various ways in which our freedoms might be curtailed. We need to demand more transparency. And then I think as we mobilize a public to really exhibit what they think is in the public interest, we're going to see a far better balance happen.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think talking specifically about data, is there a danger in how we are conceptualizing public data? Like, does calling it public automatically strip away the context or remove it from, what we might expect of our privacy?
Oh, I love this question. Yeah, I do think that we engage in this sort of binary thinking. It's either private or it's public, rather than thinking about, well, what is it used for? And did I consent for that particular use of that data? So I think speaking about the language of control, of agency, of what's foreseeable, what's permissible would be, I think, kind of liberating to our mindset, right? Because the binary serves people who play with the permission that that gives. But to have more nuance, I think would also help educate people a little bit about how this all really works.
Yeah. And I want to go back to you mentioning the World Economic Forum or Council. And while this report that we're seeing from the 404 media on ShadowDragon is focused on US government entities like ICE, have you seen this kind of surveillance tech being exported or adopted in other parts of the world? Like, is this more of a global trend?
Oh, yes. I mean, absolutely. What got me into surveillance is obviously being a Bahraini citizen. And in Bahrain, surveillance is everywhere. And it's never been just sort of a new trend. I mean, surveillance and spyware tools have been a thing way before, we started seeing more coverage of it as a result of NSO Group or the NSA, leaks and whatnot. So we see, I mean, many generations have basically known no other way to live other than being surveilled. And as soon as we basically, got the internet, it was immediately that, to the point where sometimes to qualify for a SIM card, to qualify for just in order just to be online, you have to give up a tremendous amounts of private data about yourself. And in some cases, this includes biometrics data as well. So surveillance technologies like those being developed by companies such as ShadowDragon have always been exported and adopted worldwide. And if you see Surveillance Watch as a database, it shows just truly how global the surveillance trade is. That's literally why when you go in, the first thing you see is actually a map drawing the connections of where the tech is being created, where it is being deployed, and who's profiting from these trades. And we're seeing governments, law enforcement agencies, and private entities across the globe are investing billions collectively in surveillance and spyware tools, facial recognition and other biometric surveillance, increasingly AI-powered analytics of this data, and a lot of the times is even incorrect. And then social media monitoring, to track individuals and targets of interest. So surveillance was always incredibly global. There are some companies in places like the UK, Canada, or the US who sometimes will build spyware and surveillance tech exclusively to sell their tools to foreign agencies and bypassing sanctions and export laws because it's a very, very lucrative industry. So this tech is not just falling in the hands of governments, but we're seeing more and more. It's also in the hands of corporations and private intelligence firms as well, that these governments can then hire, and repurpose or resellers and other regional distributors who would basically repackage these tools and sell them and obscuring where it originated from. So sometimes you would see a tool like ShadowDragon being used even in China or, any place that could be sanctioned because it goes through first a Cyprus entity and then, another entity in Luxembourg and then in Lebanon. And then it just continues to obscure where it originated from. But a company like that could still make profit at the very end. So surveillance is not only becoming more pervasive, but and especially, under the so-called justification of national security, counterterrorism, or crime prevention, which is what ShadowDragon heavily markets itself as, and that's why it gets so much positive coverage. But we're seeing countries, not just with those with authoritarian governments, but again, a lot of governments around the world have shown significant interest in acquiring such tools to suppress dissent, monitor activists, and control narratives. And it's a very multi-layered approach to hold the entire industry accountable because it never stops at just one. These companies won't be creating these tools if there wasn't significant demand for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love how Surveillance Watch shows you this map because it just shows you how extensive the network is of players involved. And I'm curious, in response to a lot of these risks and actors employing surveillance tech, what can users realistically do to protect themselves online, especially those who are already vulnerable and targeted?
I mean, I think the best thing to do is to be more selective about what you share. I mean, I think the first time, even from the very beginning when I started using the web, it was a conscious decision for me to be physically anonymous on the web because I had a feeling that this was going to be our future. And that once I share my photos, my videos, and whatnot, there would be no going back. And so this was always the conscious decision for me. I had no idea it was going to be as bad as it is today. But it's also, I'm finding it's somewhat of a privilege to still have at least a level of anonymity on the web, but it is increasingly difficult to maintain over time. So I would say the best thing to do is just to be more selective about what you share, where, and with whom, because we don't know what the future holds in this regard. The other thing is we don't often take a step back and think about how every interaction or activity could potentially be weaponized against us and expose very private and personal information about not just us personally, but the people we engage with. So there are tons of digital security resources available on privacy tools and the importance of things like end-to-end encryption with metadata resistance, especially for messaging, which is where we share our most private and intimate details. So I would urge people, to just always stay up to date with the latest version of these resources. In terms of practical things that you can do, removing your information from people search sites and data brokers, which often collect and then sell personal data. Avoid oversharing personal information on social media or other platforms. And this is regardless of whether or not it's decentralized and whatnot. Again, we cannot predict the types of technologies that are coming out. So being cautious about also disclosing location, habits, or relationships, and then just more basic things when browsing the web, like declining unnecessary cookie tracking, disabling cross-app tracking in your phone settings, being more conscious about how you use your maps. I would also add that, while it could be a pain, always kind of make an effort to read the privacy policies before committing to a product, push back against them, ask questions. And I think we all have to do our part to not normalize privacy intrusive technologies because ultimately it comes down to our personal choices and our role in helping not just ourselves, but also our friends and family understand the risks and their own choices, because that also impacts us as well. So just be comfortable, to talk to others about the importance of privacy and challenge, this myth that maybe, oftentimes people say, well, we have nothing to hide. But in the end, it's really not about hiding. It's about using the web with dignity.
Definitely. And it's about fighting this, framing that privacy is an a small cost, an inevitable cost that you have to pay for convenience or for innovation. Um, I want to pose a question to both of you, which is if we want to imagine a future where people's rights are protected online, what are the ingredients that we need, whether that be legal, cultural, or technological?
I'm happy to go. I think I love the nuance in this question because for so long, and I've been like working in this space for a very long time, there was a belief that if the laws just changed, it would be fine. And I think that is a necessary but insufficient evolution. Like, yes, we need a recognition of legal protections, absolutely. But the cultural practice, which is both composed of individual practice, like Esra'a just mentioned, of like your own consciousness and awareness of what you select to disclose, how you decide on your own terms, the dignity of how you want to search online, your solidarity with other people in your community, because any information you disclose about yourself may well be actually about someone else as well. There's the individual component of the cultural piece, and also a larger cultural framing of actually, we don't think this trade is worth it. Jen, to your point, like we're often told, well, a little bit of privacy invasion for some convenience is fine. And it's like, what convenience and is it worth it? The invisible trade is often not really quantified and certainly not made known to you with great detail at the point of decision making. Like Esther mentioned, privacy policies are not designed to be user friendly most of the time. They hide the ball. And so culturally, we also have to exercise our voice in demanding and then shaming the things that are actually not serving us, right? And that's why it's so important to like sign the petitions, go to the marches, write to your elected officials, like participate in civil society and pushing back on this, because that's how you sort of change the cultural backdrop that has allowed this to quietly be normalized. And then for technological, I mean, I do think we see in the fights around encryption that are unfolding globally right now the importance of actually having frameworks that respect there are certain lines that and certain protections needed for our zones of privacy, our zones of communication, our zones of interaction that cannot be breached and should not be breached. And we're seeing that view put forth in these sort of attacks on encryption that we're seeing in France and in the UK and sort of, at these episodic moments throughout the world. So technologically, we need to be looking at what protects our privacy, and encryption is a key example to say, you know what, we're not actually going to compromise on these technological approaches. The legal framework to challenge any incursions that are made. And culturally, we need to be very loud about what we will politically accept and what we won't.
Yeah, I love that answer. So I know we're running out of time, but before we close, I just want to ask both of you, in one sentence, what is one thing you hope people take away from today's conversation? What do you want people to think about?
I'm happy to go and let
Oh
Esra'a
yeah,
have the
you
last
go.
word.
I'm still kind of collecting my thoughts on that one. You go first.
Yeah, of course. I want you to have the last word because you are the expert here. To me, I think so often when you hear about these sort of things that are happening or these incursions into our dignity and privacy, it's easy to feel helpless. It's very easy to be like, oh no, it's all bad out there. And I think what I want people to walk away with is there are actually choices you can make for yourself and for your loved ones about what you put out there. Make those choices. They really do matter. If you feel like, oh no, I didn't know this, and now cat's out of the bag, the data's out there, remember, you can write to many of these companies and actually request your data be deleted. You can say, yeah, actually, about that, this trade, this exchange, it's not what I thought. So you have agency both upfront and you have agency after the fact, and we only maintain that and only have this sort of ability to get those legal, cultural, technological changes that are ultimately all political if you exercise that agency. So please, please, please don't lose hope. Like actually, your hope is the only thing that keeps us going.
I mean, that pretty much sums up exactly what I was going to share. One thing that I would add to that is that we cannot resist what we don't know. So I would say that always be alert about who's surveilling us, push back against it, resist it, and then support organizations that are helping us resist it at that legal and technological level, whether it's organizations like EFF, whether it's organizations like the Tor Project, but there are tons of also global and local organizations at a regional or local level, wherever you may be based, that are also doing this type of work, sometimes in extremely challenging circumstances where we don't even have the legal frameworks to begin putting some of these legal, measures in place to protect ourselves. And that makes it that the only way we can do so is often only at the technological and cultural level, and very few of it at the legal level. But whatever happens in certain jurisdictions does trickle down to us. So it creates a very positive impact. So I would say that, definitely don't feel overwhelmed. Pick your battles, but also just, again, be conscious about what you share with whom and where. And again, just support the very small civil society organizations, many of whom are under threat, and many of them are really struggling to survive in many countries around the world. So find these out, seek them out, and yeah, just play a more active role in being more engaged.
Absolutely. It all comes down to the actions that we can take today. Thank you both so much for this conversation, and thank you to everyone who joined us live. If you want to take action, Mozilla has launched a petition calling for accountability and oversight of companies like ShadowDragon. You can scan the QR code on your screen right now to access the link. You can also find the link in the comments and in our original post to share. So let's keep this momentum going, and thank you again. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.